Hi, hope you guys are staying safe and healthy. You're back in session with Professor P. Today we're going to talk about that chapter on culture change and globalization. How and why do cultures change? As humans, we're constantly in a rate of change. But let's talk about why. First of all, we use the term globalization a lot. What does it really mean? Globalization is the massive spread of information, people, right, and goods all over the world. Now, how and why does culture change? We talk about discovery and invention. What is a discovery? It's an addition to knowledge. An invention is a new application of knowledge. All right, just so you guys know that. We also have something called unconscious invention, where you sort of unconsciously invent something, right? And, even with these kinds of discoveries, right? Just sort of accidentally doing it. One of the things that they talk about in your book is unconsciously like making a better tool, right? Or doing things like that. Intentional innovation is where you're deliberately trying to produce an object. You're deliberately trying to create something. How many of you want to be inventors and innovators, right? You have something, an idea, and you want to bring it to fruition, right? Some societies encourage a lot of this innovation and others may not. Now, let's talk about diffusion. Remember, we talked about this a lot this semester. Diffusion is the borrowing of cultural traits between societies. It's the borrowing of cultural traits between societies. There's different patterns of diffusion. The very first pattern is direct contact. That's where these societies have direct contact and then will borrow elements of the culture. For example, China invented paper, thus we have paper, right? Intermediate contact is where you have like a third party bringing back an idea, like tourists or missionaries or traders or things like that, all right? Stimulus diffusion is where knowledge of a trait belonging to another society stimulates you to do a local equivalent. For example, in the book, it talks about the Cherokee symbolic writing system, right? That many societies like that idea of a writing system, but they don't write in Cherokee, right? They translated it into their own language. All right, but you have to remember, diffusion is very selective. Not everything's going to diffuse, and we're not going to like everything. So we're going to reject it, right, as a society. That happens a lot. All right, acculturation is quite different than diffusion. Diffusion can be a nice process. Acculturation is negative. This is where it's borrowing in the context of a dominant and a subordinate. So one society says you must change, and they may do it under threat. Things like colonization, conquest. It's where a dominant culture really forces you to change. That becomes very important to understand. Imperialism, right? Things like that. Some of your families may have come from a country where, acculturation happened to them upon their mobility or their migration, right? You better stop speaking your language or we're going to kill you. You better stop speaking your language. We're going to put you in barns, right? Things like that. It's different than assimilation, where some of your families came over, and assimilation is not in the chapter, but a lot of you get confused. They may have come over to assimilate where they wanted to go to English-speaking school, and it wasn't a bad process for them. Acculturation is always in it within the context of a force or a threat involved. All right, let's get to revolution and rebellion. So revolution is important, but revolution is really you're replacing a country's leader. It's typically a dictator, a totalitarian government, authoritarian government, right? Rebels are people who really they could be radical. They really want to sort of overthrow or take that leader out, right? In the past, rebels or these rebellions could have been something positive, and then now sometimes you don't know the difference between like the good guys and the bad guys, right? So there's four sort of conditions or factors that could give rise to revolution and rebellion. One is the loss of prestige of an established authority. Loss of prestige of an established authority. That's number one. That means there's failure of like foreign policy. There's like financial difficulties on a big like sort of national or nation state level. Number two is threat to recent economic improvement. Threat to recent economic improvement is this. It means that there's high food prices. So many of them could be starving to death. It means there's high unemployment rates. They're not getting jobs, right? It means the local people themselves are having a lot of economic sort of hardships. The third one is indecisiveness of the government. That means they lack consistency in what they say and do. They lack consistent policy, right? They lack consistency with their people. Number 4 is loss of support of the intellectual class. Loss of the support of the intellectual class is typically where sort of we call them peasants or the peasantry. They're sort of rural farmers who sell to local markets. They stop getting support from the intellectual class who realizes, what's going on within the government. So they're buying the products from the peasants. They're providing them labor. The moment they lose that, peasants go, you know what, why not, rebel, right? Why not have revolution? All right, the interesting thing is many revolutions or rebellions where they do actually overthrow the dictator, typically they're replaced with the same kind of dictator, right? Which is typically unfortunate. So we got to remember what was going on historically when it comes to things like that. All right, other kinds of things. We want to talk about things like commercialization in our society. Commercialization, as we talked about before, is buying and selling within a market, right? We live in a commercialized society. We're going to go to Target. We're going to go buy our products, right? We're going to go to Safeway. We're going to go to Macy's, right? We're going to go to Amazon, right? When we talk about that. But remember the Hadza. Remember some of these documentaries we saw. They traded and they bartered. They had special purpose money. So when we look at a commercialized society, we look at implementing a change in a behavior, okay? So what happened with the onset of commercialization? A lot of things, drastic things happen. Commercialization, really, the introduction of money came about. Migratory labor became highly valuable, right, with commercialization. Everything became profit. Land became profit, right? We had machinery starting to come into play to replace human labor. We had now big scale, mechanized things within agriculture and, and irrigation. We also had things like class stratification happening. Once we start to say we're commercialized, we have money, we have all this stuff, we start to have division in society, right? We call class polarization happens and class stratification happens, right? We also talk about a decline in the standard of living because some of us are going to have less, some of us are going to have more within the system, right? So it becomes important to understand commercialization also impacted traditional economies. So traditional economies start to decline with the institution of commercialization. It becomes important. Everything also, a lot of things become individualized, like private property, and products and materialization and things like that. So that becomes very important to sort of understand. Another area of why and, how culture changes. Another area, if you turn your concept sheet, is religious change. We have a lot of things happening religiously. One of the biggest things is we had a growing influence of Western religions globally. So the impact of missionaries and Christianity and things like that started to impact the world. So it becomes important to understand traditional religions can also start to decline globally, and they can also start to just change. Right? For some of you guys just wrote a paper on religion and magic, and you sort of saw the changes within religious ideologies, right? Like I said, Western religions have really impacted and influenced the world. All right. Political changes. There's been a lot of stuff going on politically, and we know a lot of stuff going on recently in politics. But one of the biggest things and one of the biggest political changes to actually occur was the impact and the spread of democracy. Democracy is really when we bring our leaders to vote. A lot of people around the world have seen this and they want democracy. And that's why revolution and rebellion, some of those have happened, not always. But democracy is something that is valued within some societies, right? So that is one of the biggest. How and why does democracy spread? Sort of that whole concept of trains, planes, and automobiles, the internet, right? All of this globalization helps those ideas start to spread. And people want them. All right. Another area in political sort of life that changed was the impact of NATO. It becomes important to understand, we talk about NATO, we're talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was signed in 1949, and basically NATO is an organization where several countries are involved. right? Almost about 30 countries involved in NATO. And what it is, it's like a big police force. They implement security policies, they stop terrorism, they have like a hierarchy in there, like ambassadors and governors and things like that. But it's really to instill the spread of democracy and peace. They're sort of our allies. So when terrorist attacks do happen, people part of NATO sort of back us up, right? So it becomes important to really understand the concept of what NATO is. Another big important political change was the implementation of Geneva Conventions that came out of Switzerland. The Geneva Conventions really impacted and changed our military. Really, what it did is it prohibited certain sort of methods of warfare, right? So not using biological weaponry, don't fire unless you're fired upon, right? There are sort of protocols they talk about within the Geneva Convention. Some of you are part of the military, so you had to understand what the Geneva Conventions are, what your behavior should be like, you know, how you are treating the culture where we're at war, right? Where you guys are located, right? Citizens and children having rights under sort of Geneva Convention. But it's really important because, you know, we really are looking at guidelines, right? And protocols to really say what we can and cannot do during wartime. Kinds of weaponry, right? Kinds of behaviors. All of these kinds of things are really within a structure of how and why things are changing, right? In the military. As you can see, many cultures may change more rapidly than others, right? And whether it's revolution, whether it's commercialization, whether it's religious change, or whether it's democratic changes, you know, whether it's innovation or diffusion, cultures are changing all around the world at different rates and different times. I hope you enjoyed the chapter on culture change and globalization. Have a great day.